Persona 3 Reload launched on Switch 2 a couple of months ago, but despite relatively light visuals and good performance on other platforms, it launched with a number of issues with poor frame pacing, excessive input lag, mediocre image quality, and no high framerate performance modes. But the game was just patched with a new update, version 1.03, which promises to substantially improve the game with fixes for some of those concerns. So in today's video, I'm going to take you through the current state of Persona 3 Reload on Switch 2, focusing on key areas where the launch code was deficient. But first, a short message.
This video is brought to you by Digital Foundry and ExpressVPN. Using a VPN is swiftly becoming essential. It's an extra layer of personal security that enhances your privacy online, protecting your browser history while preventing your ISP from logging your activity on the internet. ExpressVPN wraps your traffic in an encrypted tunnel, rerouting 100% of your network traffic through secure servers. ExpressVPN has servers in 105 different countries that you can choose from, good for accessing region-locked content and services, or for remaining virtually local when traveling overseas. Rated as the #1 VPN by sites including The Verge and CNET, ExpressVPN starts from $3.49 or £2.49 in the UK per month for the basic plan with up to 10 simultaneous connections, ad blocker, and malicious site protection. Advanced and Pro plans feature more connections, more advanced protection, a password manager, and further features. Scan the QR code or go to expressvpn.com/foundry and find out how you can get up to 4 extra months thanks to our sponsor, ExpressVPN.
Issue 1. Poor frame pacing. This was probably the most annoying problem in Persona 3 Reload for Switch 2, because essentially the game targeted 30 FPS but delivered an extremely uneven cadence of frames to the display. You could expect an irregular pattern of 16 millisecond, 50 millisecond, and 33 millisecond frames, with a broken framerate cap. This behavior extended to the handheld mode as well, which ran about equally poorly. For this video, I'm using the demo version of Persona 3 Reload to represent the game's pre-patch state because it's not currently possible to download the pre-patch version of the retail game or the demo. But there was a window where the demo version wasn't patched and the retail version was patched that I took advantage of. So as of the latest patch, the game runs at a locked 30 FPS in its default configuration, with no frame pacing wobbles, which is a pretty satisfying improvement. It's also much better in the handheld mode, which runs at a similar performance level without any of the wobbles that we saw previously. So I would chalk this one up as a win for Atlus here, as this issue has been completely resolved. Issue 2. Image quality. Essentially, the pre-patch version of Persona 3 Reload is 1080p all around. It's 1080p in handheld mode and 1080p docked, and packs similar visual settings in both modes, so there really isn't a settings difference here between those two configurations. In an interview, the developers actually seem to have commented on this decision, remarking that they wanted to make sure that neither mode got tagged as inferior, which suggests an interesting approach to Switch 2 performance here that most developers don't take up for 3D software. That 1080p render seems to have been backed up by a form of TAA, but it was a form of TAA that wasn't actually very effective at addressing aliasing in the final image. I think there's some implementation issue here that's preventing effective AA in the final game because a lot of edges tend to look raw or undertreated relative to the kind of edges that we usually see in games with effective TAA. And as of the recent patch, basically all of those concerns are on shared resolution settings between the two various modes, all the anti-aliasing concerns as well. Those are all unchanged, so we're still looking at a 1080p render with similar visual settings, just like we saw before. So this might not necessarily seem like a problem at first glance, but I think there are two concerns here. The first problem is that Switch 2 is a much more powerful console in docked mode. The GPU clock nearly doubles, memory clock increases by about 50%, it's a much more capable system. And so if the portable mode can handle a full 1080p, then docked mode should probably be dialing in a substantially higher resolution, or better visual settings elsewhere, to account for that gulf in GPU performance. This is the same issue that we saw with Tokyo Mirage Sessions on Switch 1, which was another Atlus title where the developers decided to stick with the same 720p res in both modes. And I think in this case, like in that case, it isn't an ideal utilization of the hardware. Because on Switch 2, if a game is targeting 1080p in handheld mode, 1440p or something similar docked might be a realistic target. That's something we see in a variety of Switch 2 software at the moment, and something like that would be appreciated here if possible. If that's not possible, then perhaps some other settings improvements could have been in the mix here, but in the final game, we're not seeing those kinds of settings enhancements for Switch 2 in dock mode. The second concern here is the game's apparent non-use of DLSS. Now, I think it can be a little bit more forgiving here because we don't know the game's development circumstances. It might have been that implementing DLSS wasn't practical for any number of reasons, and Persona 3 Reload doesn't ship with temporal upscaling on any platform here whatsoever. It just ships with that default anti-aliasing treatment on every platform with no FSR, no TAU, nothing like that. But DLSS is the anti-aliasing and upscaler of choice on Switch 2, and it may have been able to produce some good results here. You know, we have fairly slow gameplay, we have fairly simple artwork. I think the light model could have probably done a pretty decent job here, and that could have definitely helped Atlas with the game's next issue, which is the fact that there was no performance mode. This problem is very straightforward because basically in the pre-patch version of the game, it only targeted 30 FPS. That's not unreasonable, given the fact that last-gen consoles were also 30 FPS machines, but player expectations on Switch 2 seem to have evolved somewhat, and there's a very strong demand for 60 FPS software, if at all possible. But Atlas seems to have listened to these players who did want this mode, because in the latest patch, they did add in a 60 FPS performance mode toggle into the game. And it does actually seem to hold to that 60 FPS target. Now, there are exceptions, especially in busy town areas, in the school, areas with a lot of characters walking around, but the game seems to hold in the upper 50s at worst, so it's actually a pretty good performer, all things considered. I can't speak for the entire game because I only had time to play through a pretty limited section, but I would expect that probably is going to hold true for the majority of the game content, if not virtually all game content, especially because the most taxing areas in this game tend to be the city areas, and I was able to view basically all the game's substantial city areas in my time playing. But unfortunately, to get to 60 FPS, you do have to take some visual hits. So shadow maps become lower resolution with chunkier, less distinct outlines. Shadow resolution seems to be set per scene, and certain angles and camera distances will emphasize the shadow resolution deltas more. In typical play, it's not very bothersome, but depending on the scene, you could end up with a much less defined shadow presentation. They also appear to remove the ambient occlusion entirely, which normally provides a kind of soft, subtle, imprecise shade that blooms out over most scenes. Now, it doesn't usually draw attention to itself, and arguably, it maybe leaves too little impact for modern tastes, or indeed more accurate lighting characteristics, but it's totally gone here, which is quite noticeable. Persona 3 Reload is quite lacking in general in the depiction of indirect diffuse lighting, and losing AO does kind of hurt a little bit, especially considering that I think the game actually probably looks best on PC, perhaps with a dose of SSGI. Resolution in this performance mode, though, remains at 1080p, just like every other mode in this game. So I think this might have been a good case for DLSS, where you retain certain visual settings there in exchange for internal rendering resolution and achieve a subjectively good, subjectively similar, if not better, final output using DLSS. That would have been a good option here, potentially. But I also think this just shows there's a lot of headroom in that 30 FPS mode, because they aren't really cutting very much down here to achieve 60 FPS. It's really just a couple of relatively gradual settings decreases, you know, how much time are you actually spending on an SSAO pass, how much time are you spending on those high resolution shadows. It's probably not that substantial. And other key effects that I would expect to be excised here, like the game's SSR, are not. So the game's running at 60 FPS with SSR on Switch 2, which is something we don't usually tend to see actually on the platform, at least have not seen so far. But unfortunately, for those gamers who are primarily interested in the portable aspect of the Switch 2 here, there is no 60 FPS mode for portable play. So again, DLSS in the mix, you could have maybe achieved that, but at the moment it's just a flat 1080p experience in all modes, and that leaves the portable mode presumably with not enough GPU resource to actually hit 60 FPS with anything like reasonable visual settings. The fourth issue with the game, and I don't want to harp on this too much, but it's the fact that it has too much input lag. Now, Persona 3 Reload is kind of a laggy game in general, with a pretty languid camera that responds a little bit slowly to player input. For instance, on PS4 here, across a range of shots, we get a response time of about 160 to 190 milliseconds on stick deflection, which is not great for a 30 FPS game. And keep in mind that's counting input lag from the wireless controller here as well, as the display lag here, which is about 12 milliseconds on my Q190D as reported by ratings.com. So that should be factored in here, but still substantial input lag for this game. The pre-patch Switch version of the game was much the same, logging pretty similar latency figures while just jamming the stick around. There's obviously some variance here, but nothing that was that significant relative to the PS4. And unfortunately, the new patch hasn't really done anything to allay these concerns, but it's also not making it worse, which is good because obviously we have that corrected frame pacing behavior. There's been no substantial hit to input lag, at least as far as I can see. So we're typically averaging at around 180 milliseconds on stick deflection on my TV here, and handheld mode is pretty similar as well. But of course we have that new performance mode, which does help out substantially here. So in that mode, we're looking at about, 120 milliseconds to maybe 140 milliseconds on my TV, again on stick deflection, which isn't great, but it does feel better. Now, ultimately, I think this is probably something that players just have to get used to, and it's not too bad, especially considering Persona's slower pace. But input lag remains a concern for this game across, I think, multiple platforms here. 60 FPS helps, and that kind of brings it into the realm of reasonable tolerability for me, even if it is slightly laggy. But obviously, that's not available in handheld mode, and it's also not a very good option necessarily in docked mode, because you are losing out on a lot of visual features, which is unfortunate. But I think given the kind of game that Persona 3 Reload is, you're not actually spending a whole lot of time nudging the stick in whatever direction. You're not doing a lot of aiming or anything like that. It's a game that is actually pretty slow paced. Obviously, it's a turn-based game. The combat is turn-based. So I don't think this is that big of an issue. It's just something that's kind of a minor annoyance that I think you'll probably get over. But it is worth noting here that that is a significant issue with this game, especially at 30 FPS. Now, if you listen to Atlas, Persona 3 Reload on Switch 2 commenced development shortly after the Switch 2 was announced, and they aimed to release the game as soon as possible. They even considered developing the game for Switch 1 as well, but discarded that idea as it would have taken too long to get it working on the last-gen system for their timelines. So reading between the lines here, I think you can probably say that getting bespoke Switch 2 optimizations for the platform probably wasn't a high priority. That shows, I think, in the version of the game they delivered back in October. And patch 1.03, I think at least is a corrective that brings the game back into a reasonable shape, because the awful frame pacing is fixed, which makes the game infinitely much more playable in my view. Obviously, they've added a performance mode, so it's a version of the game that I can probably recommend with certain key caveats. But it's not the kind of carefully tailored Switch 2 release that we'd like to see on the platform. It's not a game that takes advantage of DLSS and a discrete porting process to resolve issues we might have seen on hardware that's otherwise somewhat comparable, like last-gen console systems. It's not a game that actually tries to resolve those issues with a new porting effort. It's also a game that befuddlingly is still identical, basically identical it seems, in its default docked and portable configurations, and it runs at 1080p all around. That's probably a concession, if I had to guess, to get the game out of the door as quickly as possible and to minimize art and QA strain. But it doesn't leave a great taste in the mouth, especially when you look at other kinds of porting jobs to Switch 2, including a game like Final Fantasy VII Remake, for instance, another Unreal Engine 4 title that really takes advantage of the system's bespoke capabilities to deliver a really effective port. This is not a port like that. This is a port that is more of a bog standard port and is even kind of underutilizing the system in some key ways relative to expectations, even for a game that you wouldn't necessarily expect to use all the system's bespoke features. Obviously, the game could have used DLSS. It also has ray tracing support on other platforms. I don't necessarily expect everything to get utilized here, but the fact that it is so similar across its various modes does suggest a bit of a lack of optimization effort for this title. So Persona 3 Reload, I think it's in saleable shape as of the December patch, and it's an overall experience I can definitely recommend to interested players. But it's a curious Switch 2 port that feels a little bit under-resourced. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media.